everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am going to be sharing 7 misconceptions that people have about drafting and drafts. I'd like to thank the viewer Kristen and her books for suggesting this topic. It was a really good idea. I had fun coming up with some of these misconceptions I've seen from people about everything from first to final drafts, and so we're gonna dive right in. So the first misconception a lot of people have, and I feel it really holds them back from ever writing or ever finishing a project, is first drafts have to be perfect. Perfection is the enemy of good and the enemy of finished. The idea that the first draft that you write of a book has to be note perfect, I mean, like final, like publishing ready? It just holds you back. The reality is, any book that you pick up from the shelf is not a first draft. It might not even be a 5th draft. It's completely okay and normal for a first draft of a book to be a little bit messy, or at the least imperfect. Drafts do indeed run the gamut, but it's totally okay if you don't quite know what you're doing when you're writing that first draft and the sentences aren't the prettiest sentences, and maybe here or there you don't even know the right word for something, or you don't have a name for something yet and you put a little placeholder. That's totally okay, because your number one job on a first draft is to complete it. And finishing a first draft, in my opinion, is one of the hardest things to do. I mean, some of us are born drafters and some of us are born editors, and I'm a born editor. So for me, the hardest part is to get a first draft done. And if I didn't throw the idea of perfection away, I would never do anything. So screw that stupid idea. First drafts do not have to be perfect. But the second misconception I've heard is the opposite, which is that first drafts are garbage. Garbage fires always. A first draft is always terrible. The irony is, if you've seen my harsh writing advice video, I say in that video that first drafts are always garbage. But what I really meant was first drafts of first books, so the first book you've ever met, is never going to be perfect. I was just a little bit of hyperbole, but it is both true that no first draft is perfect, and it's always going to be a little bit messy, and you're always going to need to do something to it. You're going to have to edit, fix it, etc. It's not actually uniformly or universally true that every first draft is total hot garbage. Some people are really clean drafters, and I want to talk about the difference between the prose on the page, the writing, the grammar, the usage, etc. being really, really unsophisticated and messy, and the actual ideas of the book. So the pacing, the plot mechanics, structural things, character arcs needing work. You can have a first draft where you, of course, naturally have to do a lot of work on the pacing, the plot, the character arcs, etc. But the prose is actually very, very clean. The sentences themselves are in pretty good shape and don't necessarily need a total overhaul. It's the actual substance of the story that needs a lot of editing. So those tend to be cases where, of course, it's not a garbage draft. It's perfectly readable. It just needs work. There are also people who do the opposite. Their structure is actually in pretty immaculate shape, but all of the mechanics are messy. I'd say that the first one's a little bit more common, but the second one is also perfectly possible. But I'd say it's more common that people have issues with both and you need to do editing and work on both. But not everyone writes a complete garbage fire of a first draft. Which brings me to a misconception about revision. This covers subsequent drafts, draft 2s, draft 3s, whatever. And this misconception is the idea that revising a draft, taking something from, say, draft 1 to draft 2, just means doing cosmetic edits on the prose, doing line edits or copy edits. Oh, I'm just gonna pretty it up. No, that is not editing. Even cases where your structure is pretty good, you're going to have something to edit on that book, whether it's a character arc, a motivation, trimming something somewhere, because no first draft is perfect. And editing should never just be a cosmetic pass through the manuscript to clean up some language. That is how you're going to end up with a second draft that is basically just a prettier version of your first draft. Taking a book from a draft to a draft is always going to involve some substantive work on that draft. I personally don't consider copy editing or line editing, making something pretty, a draft change. I consider drafts developmental edits, so really digging into a book, that's what a developmental edit is, and working on actual concrete story, plot, character elements, like the substantive things of a novel that truly impact the reading experience in terms of story absorption, how quickly you're turning the pages, tension, etc. It pains me when I hear people say, and it's so frequently on Reddit and other parts of the internet, oh, I'm just gonna run a copy edit on this and then it's gonna be good to go. And if you just run a copy edit on your first draft, you basically still just have a first draft. So yeah. But the next misconception is the idea that editing and taking a draft from one to the next, draft one to draft two, always involves a total rewrite. Not every book is a complete teardown. This misconception is actually a fear, and it's one that I had in early days as well, because you definitely hear the stories from authors who go, I completely rewrote my book. I tore it down and restarted it from scratch, and that is my nightmare. I've never done it, and I hope to never do it. But I think that this misconception, again, holds a lot of people back because they go, I don't want to write an entire book only to have to tear the entire thing down and rewrite it. And probably my response to the previous misconception also creates fear that, oh, it's not just a pass to clean it up and make it sound pretty. I have to really dig into it. Really digging into your own work and making real changes is indeed scary, but there's a happy medium between a cosmetic pass and a total rewrite. So I encourage people not to be afraid of this misconception. First of all, a total rewrite is always a choice of the author. No one's gonna make you do a total page one rewrite, and there are those happy mediums to be found. It is, well, maybe the motivation isn't working, and admittedly throwing out a motivation and putting in a new one is a lot of work. It's an almost total rewrite, but it's not a page one rewrite. Or maybe you can just work on the foundation so that that character motivation does work. And so there's always decision-making and solutions that can be found to make a developmental edit a lot more manageable for you. So yeah, revising a draft does not have to mean a total rewrite. The fifth misconception is that there is a magic number of drafts that a book has to go through, and once you hit that magic number of drafts, it's done. Unfortunately, I can't tell you some magic number. I can't say to you, well, once you've done 3 revisions, so you're on your draft 4, then you're ready to query, or every published book is a draft 6. And there's just no universal answer. Every individual book is gonna need different levels of editing, different rounds. There are all sorts of different situations that can contribute to the number of drafts that a book can go through. It's how clean that first draft was. It's how editorial your agent is. It's whether you have CPs who give really spot on notes that create a brainwave in you of how to fix your book. It is how developmental your editor is if it's selling to a publishing house. It's whether you do multiple rounds there of developmental editing. It just totally depends. There are books on the shelf behind me by professional writers where it could be a second draft published, it could be a 4th draft, or it could be a 10th. I have a friend where her published book is the 12th draft of the book because she worked on this passion project over years and years and years. And when you do have a passion project, a book that is a passion project, those usually do go through more rewrites because you're not just throwing the book out if it's not working in the market. So every book is going to have a different number of drafts. Which brings me to my next misconception, the 6th misconception, which is the idea that, well, if a writer has to do 1,000,000 drafts, that clearly means that the book isn't as good as a book that only needed 3 drafts. No. Now, tons and tons of revision can be the sign of a novice writer, a newer writer, but that doesn't mean that those final drafts, when that writer has leveled up their skill and produced that final book, that doesn't mean that final book can't be a masterpiece. There are plenty of writers who do work on passion projects for years and years and years, so naturally those books go through more drafts than someone who, goes through the cycle on a book in a year and a half. where that final draft is just magic. And similarly, just because a book takes one person only a year to write and they're done in 3 drafts doesn't mean that that's a masterpiece either. It could be, it couldn't be. The book that needs 12 drafts might not be perfect either, though. Well, that's our last misconception. Perfect's the wrong word. A masterpiece, a great book. So it really runs the gamut, and every writer is going to have their own personal process, and it's also going to vary book to book. Some books don't need as many drafts. Some books can't have as many drafts. When you get into professional publishing and you're writing on deadline, sometimes you're only allowed to do 1 major edit. So whether you like it or not, draft 2 is published, even if it's not the book that you want it to be. That does happen. So it really just varies. But I encourage you not to think, oh, a writer rewrote their book 8 times, it must be bad. The number of drafts a book goes through is not an automatic indicator of quality. And then that's our final misconception. I used the word perfect in relation to final, and it's wrong. That's wrong, because no final draft is perfect. No final draft is truly final for the author. And this is where we get into kind of nebulous, like, author feelings territory, because that's the thing. A final draft can be final. It can be final in the sense that you have to stop working on it. You have to turn it in and it is published, or you choose to publish it. You just gotta, there's only so much you can work on a book, because you can also overwork a book and mess it up. More drafts doesn't always equal good. I mean, that's the last point, isn't it? Sometimes you just gotta take your hands off a story and let it rest. And sometimes that taking your hands off a story and letting it rest is the final version that is published. Here's a secret that's not really a secret. Most authors are never happy with the final drafts of their books. Like, there's always something more that you could do. And especially once a book is published and the public gets their hands on it and their reviews, sometimes they will point out things where you're like, drat. Or you just know realistically, this is a hindsight thing as you move along in your writing career, that you're a much better writer now. And of course you could take an older project and like really shine it up because you made novice mistakes in that book, but it's too late. It's too late. Unless you self-publish, it's too late. And so you just have to emotionally let go of final drafts. They are final, but they're not perfect. So that's to make you feel better. If your feeling as you're editing your work that you're never quite happy with it, welcome, join the club. This is basically how we all feel about our books. So yeah, the end goal honestly is not perfection, because final drafts aren't perfect. It's just done. You do as much work as you can possibly do on a book. You do as many drafts as is needed on a book, and then you just hope it turns out okay. You do as much as you can, and then you move on to your next book and you start the whole process over again. Yeah. So those are 7 misconceptions that I've seen about drafting and drafts, and I want to know down below in the comments, what misconceptions have you had about drafts or drafting, you know, before you started writing or now, or misconceptions that you've heard about drafts and drafting that drive you a little bit up the wall. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more videos like this. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.